With regards to, for example, say, some children's residential care homes, we obviously got the welfare principle where the welfare of the child must be at the forefront of staff's minds. That's consistent with the Children's Act and also the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. If staff were led to believe or believed through whatever means, whatever policy or whatever, that they were not allowed to use a restrictive technique, but by omitting a restrictive technique from the control program, they were not able to control vulnerable children who are putting themselves at risk, for example, would that be a breach of the Act if someone was to die?
Well, let's give you an example. If in fact, as a public authority, a carer in some residential accommodation, you sat back and watched one person assault another vulnerable person and didn't intervene, then I think that would be a breach of a whole series of English law issues as well as probably the European Convention. So you have to take action to protect people. That's what you're paid to do usually. How much intervention is necessary will depend on the circumstances. Obviously, you have a duty to protect yourself as well in those circumstances, but if you can intervene using a proportionate response that will not hurt the perpetrator very much, if you can avoid that, and will protect the vulnerable person or the potential victim, you need to intervene. It's quite difficult to go beyond those kind of principles to say, well, you can intervene in this way and in these circumstances, but you have a duty to intervene because you have a duty to protect the person who's a potential victim or who is vulnerable.
If we say, for example, had a residential care home looking after vulnerable children or adults, and we had a staff demographic of middle-aged people, possibly in their late 40s, 50s, some carrying injuries, potentially back injuries, and the people they were looking after were younger, stronger and fitter than them with vulnerabilities and disabilities, if that's the right words to use. Therefore, by default, the client or service user group have more ability and natural skill and power than the carers. If a service user was placing themselves at harm or harming someone else, and a member of staff was to respond to that, and their proportionate application of force was to, say, apply a hold or a lock which caused discomfort or pain, say, to a service user's wrist, for example, a wrist lock like the police use, that prevented the service user from harming the person in extreme cases, for example, like putting their head through a window or jumping out of a window. Would that be consistent with what you're advocating?
I have to go back and say reasonable force is necessary. So when you're making an assessment of reasonable force, you need to assess the potential harm by not acting. So if somebody is having a pillow fight, then of course you can't put them in some kind of lock which causes them pain. If in fact the person is likely to inflict, if somebody's got a knife, for instance, and they're about to stab somebody else, and their life is at risk, then of course you can inflict some pain on them in order to protect the other person. In relation to human rights, the principle is clear. You can't use you can't use torture, inhuman or degrading treatment in any circumstances, but you can use reasonable force. But the force that you use has to be reasonable in the circumstance. And if they were subject to discipline, then it might be possible for them, if the use of reasonable force was justified to protect some other vulnerable person from some action, it may well be they'll have a defence to the discipline, even though they have a non-restraint policy, though that would depend on the details of that. The reverse is also true, of course. If a non-restraint policy led to a vulnerable person being injured, then it may be that that vulnerable person could take action against the company for stopping them being protected.